Thank you very much. This morning's scripture reading comes from the New Testament, from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. He entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was rich. He was trying to see who Jesus was, but on account of the crowd he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for I must stay at your house today." So he hurried down and was happy to welcome him. All who saw it began to grumble and said, "He has gone to be the guest of one who is a sinner." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor. And if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek out and to save the lost."
Well, we are well into our series on hookers, looters, and cheats, curious companions of Jesus, and that's a pretty funny title and catches some people offhand, unless, of course, you know my relatives are in town. Had to get that one in. Ha, ha, ha. But seriously, in the Bible, we think we know these stories about who these people are and how Jesus relates to them and everything. And what we find is that sometimes things aren't exactly as they seem. And we look at it just from a little bit different perspective than usual. And we find a depth to a character that we didn't know was there. And we find that maybe what we learned in Sunday school or some other things about these stories aren't necessarily the way things actually are. For instance, Nancy was here telling the kids about how Zacchaeus was so short, right? When you look at the original Greek, Eric pointed this out the other day. I didn't go look it up. But he was saying that the pronoun he, when it says that he was short in stature in that Bible verse there, it doesn't necessarily point back to Zacchaeus. It could just as easily point back to Jesus. Now, how's that for mind-blowing, thinking about Jesus being a short little stature person, right? It does change your perspective on stuff. So opening those spaces of being able to think about people in a new way helps you to widen that space enough to be able to think about how then does that talk about the ministry of Jesus in a new way? How then does that talk about how we relate to one another in a new way? So this series is one that helps us just shift our perspective enough to be able to start imagining how things could be a bit different. And things are different sometimes. There are times when the rug gets pulled out from underneath you. These are my 5 sisters, or my 4 sisters and myself, with Santa. And there's one thing that was a standard in my family growing up, and that was the idea of fairness. My mother was huge on the idea of fair. She would lay out the Christmas gifts every year on the bed, right? And she'd lay them all out, one sister to the other sister to the other sister. And if Karen, the oldest, got something like a sweater and a book, then everybody else had to get some piece of clothing and either a record album or a book or something like that. And if they weren't exactly the same things, they had to at least add up to the same price, right? Because she didn't want anyone to think that she was playing favorites. That was one of the things she used to do. Another thing is, like, if Susan got cosmetics in her stocking, then all of us had to have something like that in our stocking. One year she did a whole stocking for me on nails, you know, manicuring nails and stuff. I think it was a subliminal suggestion that I stop biting my nails because I have no nails. So those were the kinds of things my mom did to go out of her way to make things fair. I don't know why fairness was such a big deal for her, but it was. Maybe it's because we teased her all the time and told her that Nancy was her actual favorite. She's the middle one. Middle ones are always the favorite, right? Or maybe it's because my mother wasn't really treated very fairly in her own childhood. So she thought that it was something she wanted to pass on to her kids. I don't know what caused her to think fairness was such a big value, but it was a huge value in our family growing up, until it's not. There was a time when I was counting on that fairness, and it wasn't there. And the rug was pulled out from underneath me. And it seems really silly when you look back on it, but at the time, my world was rocked. And that's the time when my sister Susan, who had come back from college and had to go to work, and I had just come back from high school and I had on a sweater, you know. She liked the sweater. She was going to work. Can I wear that sweater? No. I want that sweater. Just take it off. You're not going to use it. Take it and I can wear it to work. You have a whole closet full of clothes. I'm not giving you my sweater. Well, I don't understand. Why can't I have your sweater? Get over it, Susan. Go get your own stuff. I'm the youngest of 5 children. It's in the job description. Even if you don't need it, you don't give it to your sister. Susan would not let this go. And pretty soon I had a phone call. Chris, Mom's on the phone. That's what they do. They call Mom. Because they can't fight their own battles, right? I know. So Mom, I'm thinking, Mom's good. I'm right here. It's my sweater. I've already got it on. It's the right thing. It's the fair thing to do. She's going to be on my side. I got nothing to lose. So I pick up the phone in the other room, and I say, hi, Mom. Sorry, Susan's crazy. And she says, Chris, give your sister the sweater. And I said, what? It's my sweater. I have it on. Are you going to go anywhere tonight? No. Then give it to her. Mom, it's my sweater. I'm not giving her my sweater. Well, Chris, I'm tired. It's been a long day. The last thing I need is you girls fighting at home just to keep the peace. Give your sister the sweater. I hate it when I hear that tone of voice in my mother's voice, you know. She's tired. She's had a bad day. I didn't want to give up the sweater, but I didn't want to make my mom any more sad. All right, I'll give her the sweater. But it's not fair. Just so you know, it's noted. It's not fair. If fairness was such a big deal, why was my mom giving it up here? I couldn't believe it. It was my turn to be right. But it wasn't about fair. And my mom said that to me on the phone. She said, Chris, this is not about fairness. This is about love. Give your sister the sweater. And I didn't do it because I loved my sister. I did it because I loved my mom. Just so you know. Although, when I was thinking about this whole idea of fairness, you know, you grow up and you think, how many people thought fair was like the main point? And then you grew up and you're like, okay, fair is really not the main point. The rest of the world's really not fair. That kind of rocks your world. You get the rug pulled out from underneath you a little bit. And I was thinking about that story with my mom, and it got me thinking that we had lots of values in our family growing up as kids. And fairness was one of them, and it's a good value. It's not a bad value at all. But when it comes into conflict with the relationships that you have with one another, then you got to question it. You got to wonder if that's really what it's all about or not. Because what my mom was telling me that day was it wasn't about being fair. It was about holding the relationships together. Living out your life in love is a whole nother thing. And when love fights fairness or greed or vengeance or any other value that you might have running your life, love wins every time. And that was a value in my family that I didn't realize until that day. The relationships mattered. And that topped everything else. When you're a family of 5 kids, now I lost the other picture, Nick. I saved one picture and lost the other one. There's another really great picture of the five of us all grown up. There it is. Thank you. When you have a family of five, you end up sharing things, whether you want to or not. When you have 5 kids within 7 years and you're buying shoes and coats and food and entertainment and all those things that kids need, you end up sharing not because it's the fair thing to do, but because you love each other. And whether I would admit that or not, most of the time I would have taken off that sweater and given it to Susan because I loved her. So relationships matter, and to hold them together, even if it's in conflict with something else that's a good value too, love is the thing that wins every time. And that's exactly, I think, the story that's told about Zacchaeus today. Zacchaeus was somebody who was a chief tax collector in Jericho, which was under Roman rule. And remember last week we were talking about Matthew, right? The disciple who was also the tax collector. And Eric was telling you how taxes are collected in Rome. The whole idea is that they're bid out like projects on roads and bridges and all that kind of stuff. If Rome needed something built, they would put out the contract on a project and say they needed something like $20 million to run this project. And so you would bid on this project by saying that you would not only raise the 20 million, but you'd raise like 27 million, and you'd get to keep 5, and you'd give Rome 22 million, which is even more than they wanted. So now, whoever gives the most money to Rome ends up getting the bid, right? And all that does is give you the authority to raise the money yourself. And then Matthew goes around and collects money from the folks in order to pay for that bid. Well, Matthew is really a middle manager in this scenario, and Zacchaeus is the chief tax collector. Zacchaeus is the one that actually puts the bid in with Rome. And the way that those bids worked for Rome was you paid Rome first. So you had to have enough money in your account to pay the 22 million that you said you'd raise for them up front. And then you got the authority to go around and collect all the taxes. And that was his livelihood. So he always had to have enough money in his account to be able to pay whatever Rome was asking for first. And then he had to work hard to buy it back. And he was the one that hired people like Matthew to go around and actually collect the taxes, but he was like the CEO of that area. So you can imagine that, remember last week we were talking about how nobody liked Matthew because he was a blasphemer for the Jewish tradition, right? Because he was dealing with Gentiles, which you're not allowed to do as a Jew. He was collecting money from the Jews, his very own people, to give it to a government that they didn't even acknowledge existed. The one who called Caesar God. So he's stealing money from his own people to give money to a government he doesn't even acknowledge. And he's a Jew, doing this to other Jews. So remember, if they didn't like Matthew because of that, think of how much more they despise Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus is the one in charge of the whole thing, and he's the one that's really getting wealthy off of this. He has to, because he has to pay Rome up front, right? But you can imagine what his house must have looked like. It must have been this palatial mansion. And because of that, he was separated from almost everybody else in the community, right? The top 1%, so to speak. So he's there, and if he even bothers or dares to leave his apartment or his house or his mansion, gosh, I can't even think in those terms, he has to have bodyguards with him everywhere, right? Because everybody hates him. So what kind of life is that? Here he's got all this wealth, he's got all this fame, literally everybody loves him, but he's probably infamous, right? Because everybody hates him. Everybody knows him, but everybody hates him. So what kind of life is that? Is he really Jewish? Is he not? He's dealing with Gentiles, so he's not allowed back in the temple. Where's his community? So for all of his wealth, Zacchaeus probably was still yearning for something. And it's apparent, I think, in this text because he slips out of his house and he goes out by himself in the middle of the crowds looking for something. looking for something about this man that everyone's talking about now because he's been healing people. Miracles are happening. And he's preaching this way of living that really doesn't mesh with the whole Jewish idea of things, but it doesn't mesh with Rome either. It's a whole new way of being in the world. So he wants to learn more. So he slips out, and he's looking for Jesus. Now, Eric wrote a sermon for this series on Zacchaeus, and he did a really good job, I think, of depicting what that scene must have looked like for Zacchaeus when he comes out. So I want to read this to you. So if you just kind of, when you listen to stories, either close your eyes or whatever, and just kind of imagine what the scene must have been like for Zacchaeus as he slips out of his house. Zacchaeus is a clever man, and he spots a sycamore tree down the road directly in Jesus' path. He hurries over and he climbs up it, and now he's got a great view of Jesus. But suddenly, he's all too aware of his technical blunder. Yes, he can see Jesus just fine. He can see everyone, in fact, but that means everyone can see him. Zacchaeus, that scumbag, the one who robs us of our wealth, cries the town people. Hey, Jesus, see that guy over there? His name's Zacchaeus. You have to go over there and stop him from robbing us blind. What do you want us to do with him, Jesus? Shall we loot this looter's fancy house? Shall we burn it down? Shall we stone him to death? Just say the word. We've been waiting for this opportunity for a long time. Yes, the crowd is buzzing with curses and gruesome suggestions for a remedy to their oppression. Zacchaeus is literally stuck. He can't get down from the tree because the crowd is now surrounding it, like barking hounds who have treed a raccoon. And there's this man of spirit who has the crowd eating out of his hand. The crowd wants vengeance. The crowd wants violence. All Jesus has to do is give a nod of his head of approval to the crowd, and Zacchaeus is a goner. All Zacchaeus can do is stay in that tree and await his fate. Zacchaeus looks down nervously as Jesus stops beneath him, and for a long moment their eyes meet. Zacchaeus feels like the spirit man is looking right through him. He can tell that Jesus knows what he himself knows. He has been looting the people's wealth year after year, and their hatred for him is founded in justice. And if Jesus is a man of justice, he probably will give the mob their long-awaited chance to make it right, to make Zacchaeus pay dearly, maybe with his life, whatever this spirit man decides. And after a few moments that seem like an eternity, a smile suddenly appears on Jesus' face, and he calls out so that everyone can hear. Hey, Zacchaeus, friend, come down. Don't you remember that you invited me to your house tonight? I've been looking so much forward to having dinner with you tonight. Imagine the surprise in Zacchaeus. Imagine this angry crowd that's gathering underneath him, that's just waiting to string him up on a tree, and the guy that can make it happen does the exact opposite. He calls him a friend, and he invites him down from the tree. Now, Zacchaeus must be thinking, is this a trick? Is this guy just trying to get me down from the tree so that they can lynch me? All that must be running through his head. Why would a spirit man think of me as a friend when he knows that I've betrayed my own people, when he knows that I'm a looter and a cheat? Why would he want to be my friend? And yet this man looks sincere. So he risks it. He climbs down from the tree. Jesus puts his arm around him and walks him home, as a friend would do. Of course, the crowd is going nuts. What's going on? They're so dumbfounded by the response of Jesus that they don't know what to say. Surely this is not a justice issue. This is not fair. But Jesus doesn't respond in the way the mob expects, because it's not about fair. It's about love. And it's about restoring relationships. And Jesus had been known for all of the healings, the miraculous healings, all the way up to this point in his ministry. This is no different. It's a miraculous healing. He restores the relationship of Zacchaeus to Jesus, to God, to his community. And Zacchaeus now has this open space, this space to be accepted as is. Zacchaeus didn't ask for Jesus' forgiveness. Jesus just gave it without even being asked. He gave his love. And now this space exists. What's Zacchaeus going to do with it? Is he going to trust Jesus? Is he going to respond in love back? What would that mean? His whole life would have to change. But Zacchaeus makes the choice. Just like every other healed person that Jesus met along his ministry, he responded immediately. Get up and walk are those miracles. Zacchaeus came down and joined in. Whatever I have cheated anyone, I will return fourfold. I will give half of my fortune to the poor. Immediately changed relationships happen. Because it's not about right or wrong. It's not about fairness. It's not about anything that gets in the way of love and relationships. And that's what Jesus is saying to us in this Zacchaeus thing. And Zacchaeus responds in love. And brokenness gives way to wholeness. Lives are changed. Communities are built. Relationships are healed. So Jesus looks up and says, today, salvation has come to this house. Today, right here, right now, salvation is here. Because salvation is not something that happens to you far off in a faraway place, maybe called heaven, at a later date and time after you've died. Salvation is here, right now, in the healing and the wholeness of relationships, in the love that follows you around and builds community in a way that no one can deny it, that we are compelled to respond back in love. That's what Jesus is calling salvation. Wholeness, healing, brokenness giving way to reality and life abundant. That's salvation. And wouldn't that be marvelous if we thought about that in our own relationships? What is it that's stopping our relationships from living in this life abundant? What is it that's stopping us from just being overwhelmed by the love that we've received or given in the last 24 hours? Think on those relationships. What's directing them? Is it love? Is it guilt? Is it obligation? Is it shame? Is it this idea that somehow money and prestige and power and everything is the way to really live life, but it blocks out this person that you are inside yelling to say, I'm a person who loves and needs to be loved? What's stopping us from taking Jesus seriously, from realizing that our relationships have already been healed, that salvation is here and now? Think on your relationships. Let go of the tree. Come down. For today, salvation has come to this house. Amen.